Good evening, everyone. Welcome to The Future We Want, World Refugee Day 2020. My name is Joel Lindsay. I am the president of UNYP Queensland. And before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being held on Turrbal and Yagara lands. And we, on behalf of all of UNAA, respectfully acknowledge the elders of this land, past, present, and also the future community leaders. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded and always will be Aboriginal land. As an extra piece of engagement, we'd like to ask anybody from watching across the country, pop in the chat where you're from, what traditional owners of the land you're watching from. We find it a really interesting and engaging way to find out more about the different nations of Australia. This is our second online event as part of the webinar series, The Future We Want. We're really trying to focus hard on, life now and life post-COVID. What do we want as young Australians to be the future? So thanks to those of you who came to our last event, looking at Indigenous issues with young community Indigenous leaders. It was fantastic. And that's been recorded and shared, so you can see that one as well. And this is over the second event, and we're happy to have you here as well. I'm going to pass you over quickly to our events manager, Sarah, who had a massive part in putting together this awesome event. And she'll introduce a bit of housekeeping and also introduce our fantastic moderator for today. And just a side note, tonight is being recorded, so you can view it later, but also be mindful that it is being recorded and it'll be a permanent record of what happens in the chat, etc.
Hi there, my name is Sarah Smale. I'm the events coordinator alongside Ishara, who does fantastic work as well. So this event will be recorded and can be viewed later on YouTube. We suggest donating to excellent local groups supporting asylum seekers and refugee rights, including Multicultural Australia, Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and Vortex, the refugee tutoring service. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the chat, throughout the discussion. We will monitor these questions and choose the appropriate and most popular ones for the Q&A section after the open discussion. We have an excellent panel of speakers with varied experiences, which should create an interesting and insightful discussion. So I'll now pass on to Sanam, who should really also be a panel speaker herself due to her fantastic work working within mental health research. So if you could briefly, Sanam, if you could briefly tell us about your work and then take over as moderator. Thank you. We hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome aboard. And I'm really excited to be here today with such great panelists. Thrilled to be joining the same platform as you. And so I'm currently a research officer at the Queensland Centre for Mental Health Research, and the few big projects that I'm working on are to do with the refugee communities here. So we recently did an evaluation of the multicultural therapy program that's being run at World Wellness Group here in Brisbane. And now we're doing an evaluation of a suicide prevention training program that's being developed by the Queensland Transcultural Mental Health Centre. And other than that, I'm also doing my PhD full-time. I recently started, and that's also focusing on the mental health of the refugee and migrant communities and how we can reduce the stigma of mental health within these communities. That's a little bit about me, and I'm also from an Afghan background. I moved to Australia in 2009 and have been active in the Afghan community since. And welcome here, and we'll now get started with the panel. I'll try not to spend too much time talking about myself. So if to get started, if I could ask all the panelists to just quickly introduce yourself and the work that you do and the impact that that has on our community. Maybe we'll start with Weishi. You're on mute.
I was muted, sorry about that. So yeah, hello. I am currently the acting president of an organization which has a very long name, and we usually call it Vortex, but it stands for Volunteer Refugee Tutoring and Community Support. Yeah, and I might just refer to it as Refugee Tutoring Queensland. So we are a special program of St. Vincent de Paul Society of Queensland. Basically, we are between 100 to 150 groups of volunteer tutors who go out to local refugee families in the Greater Brisbane region, and we might help those families with the diverse range of issues that might come around with people settling into a new society. So for example, with the children, we might help them with homework, and with the adults, it might be writing down a resume, or how to get driver's license, how to catch public transport, sometimes even how to budget or how to shop, depending on what sort of needs they have. And so it's quite a large organization. We are very much indebted to our very active and large network of volunteers. So I've been in this organization for some 6 years, and I recently became the president. So apart from volunteering, I am also a recently admitted solicitor, and throughout my years of studying law in university, I've done some pro bono work in other space to help with refugees and asylum seekers, such as in Rails in South Bank. So they are a legal center that basically provides legal aid to asylum seekers and refugees, and also Access Community Services, Sovos Legals, various organizations that provide support in different roles. Yeah, that's about it.
Jono? Thank you, Vivi.
Hey everyone, it's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion, and thanks to organisers for inviting me to join in. So my name is Jonathan Sree. I'm a local city councillor here in Brizzy. So I've been a local politician for just over 4 years now. Before that, I was working in a few different frontline roles. One of my main roles was as what was called like a house parent, which was basically a sort of youth worker support advocacy kind of role, working with asylum seeker children who've come to Australia by boat without their parents. So that was a really interesting kind of, social work, youth work role. I got quite interested in refugee rights because my dad comes from Sri Lanka, he's Tamil, and most of my dad's family were displaced by the civil war in Sri Lanka and have since resettled in Canada or the UK or Australia. Classic story of people's being scattered across the globe. So yeah, I got interested in green politics in large part because of my concerns about human rights and social justice stuff, and found myself really interested in local politics because I think grassroots, bottom-up community organising is one of the more effective pathways to social change. So I'm really interested in conversations about advocacy and how we shift conversations, but also what is our role as, I guess, professionals in different fields. What moral obligations do we have to speak out against human rights abuses? Because a lot of people would say, Jono, you're a local councillor, immigration policy has nothing to do with you, but I think we all have that obligation to speak out about these kinds of injustices. So looking forward to the discussion.
Sorry, Sanam, I think you're on mute.
Oh no, hello. Thank you, Jono. Okay, if you could please introduce yourself and your work as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's so nice to be tuning in tonight. And I'm actually dialing in from Victoria. I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung at the moment, and pay my respect to traditional owners here. And I am representing the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre tonight. I'm also a local councillor in the city of Port Phillip, but the organisation I work for is the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, where I'm currently the advocacy manager. I've been there for about 6 or so months, and it's been an incredible ride because the organisation was already really stretched to its limits. And for some of you who might not be across what the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre does, it does pretty much everything from frontline services, employment services. We have a food bank, we have ESL classes, we have social enterprises, 2 social enterprises that employ people directly into work, a cleaning social enterprise, and then also catering social enterprise. Obviously the pandemic really stretched the organisation beyond its limits, and particularly at a time when also fundraising across the country for so many NGOs is down, where people are losing their jobs and really struggling. But so the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre is an incredible organisation, and I'll have more of an opportunity to talk about it tonight, I'm sure, as we go through some of the questions. But I became involved in refugee advocacy work really because of my own personal journey of, I was 4.5 years old when a civil war erupted in Sarajevo in former Yugoslavia, my home country. and my family fled pretty much overnight, leaving everything behind, which is the story for so many refugees. We lived in Serbia under very difficult circumstances for 3 years. I was just going into year 1, year 2, when we entered Germany without permission. It took the German government 24 hours to process our application and say, you're most likely genuine refugees, and offer us all of the opportunities that every other person living in Germany had, including education, healthcare, social welfare. We lived a really good life in Germany for 3.5 years, but then the German government decided that the war in Syria had finished and that we should either go back or go somewhere else. And for so many people who've been through civil war, you know that the impact of civil war don't just finish, that they're ongoing and long-lasting and intergenerational. And my mum did everything that she could. My father stayed behind in the war and he died. He was killed very quick into the war. And my mum, single parent with 3 boys, tried everything to get us out of the circumstances we were in. We applied to come to Australia and they said Australia takes too long, just you have to go somewhere else. And we were accepted to go to America, and my mum for months and months couldn't sleep because she was so worried about going to a place where there is no social safety net, there's no Medicare, there's no, she was a single parent, she'd learned English at school but wasn't that fluent, and thought, well, if this is where we end up, I'll probably have to start taking my kids one by one out of school so that they can start working and we can. And my mum always valued education really above everything else. So for her, that was really a nightmare situation that she thought we were going into. On the day that she thought in the mail our tickets to fly to America had arrived, she tells a story where she didn't get out of the bath for about 3 hours because she was too scared to go and actually open the mail. And when she finally did, it was actually our visas to come to Australia, which is incredible. So I was 11.5 years old when we arrived in Australia. And my experience of arriving in Australia as a refugee is so different to the experience that people are now facing, which is what's led me into refugee advocacy work, because it's now more important, I think, than ever before. We're up against a particularly cruel government and particularly cruel circumstances for people. So thank you for having me tonight. I really look forward to being part of this panel and having this conversation with you tonight.
Thank you again. That's great. Last but not the least, Bill.
Thank you, Sanam, and evening everyone, and great to be here and be part of this great panel. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm fortunate enough to be the CEO of Multicultural Australia, based in Brisbane. And we are Queensland's largest refugee settlement service. We provide settlement services for thousands of new Queenslanders each year. And we also support people seeking asylum, international students and other migrants to be socially and economically engaged in our community. And of course, many of these people have come from highly vulnerable situations and they're looking for a safe place. Just heard Oggie's story before as a good example. And so our objective is to help them not just survive but thrive here in Queensland, get the same fair go as all of us, and help them work towards a better life for themselves and their family. Beyond this, we also have an even more important leadership role in changing the conversation and seizing every opportunity to advance a multicultural Australia which creates work and a strong sense of belonging, so that everyone has the opportunity to contribute in any way they can here in Queensland. So that's what we do, and we're very passionate about that, and I look forward to being part of the panel this evening. Thank you, Sanam.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's great to have you all here and the great work that you're doing. I'm sure we'll have a really good discussion tonight. Just to get started, if I could, I'll just, unless I'm asking anyone specifically, I'll ask the questions and feel free to make your comments. So the first question will just be that if you'll be able to differentiate the definition of refugee and asylum seeker, and briefly take us through the process of immigration to Australia and touch on different types of visa like protection visa, SHEV and TPV.
I can start with a definition if you like, and then pass on to someone else. And I know this definition because I made a video in year 10 when I was trying to get good marks in one of my subjects about this very specific topic. So really, refugees are people who've been accepted into a host country and have been through a humanitarian process or through a different process, and their refugee status has been accepted. Whereas people seeking asylum are people who haven't received permission to enter a host country and only apply for refugee status or for some other determination after they've entered a host country. So maybe leave it there and pass on to someone else to talk about some of the other conditions.
Thank you.
Okay, you're probably the best person to talk about the different visa classes.
Oh.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so there's lots of different visa classes, and I actually don't know enough about all of them, to be honest, because they're changing all the time, and the actual policy detail of them is so complicated and purposely complicated in order to make it as difficult for people to receive them as possible. So we have a lot of people who in Australia are at the moment seeking asylum, and they're not necessarily people who are on bridging visas, but many of the people that live in the community might be on a bridging visa, and a bridging visa is really just a short-term protection visa whilst people's applications are being assessed and their determinations being determined. The chefs, particularly for people to do work in regional Australia, so there's a special visa class for people so that they can, they're encouraged to work in regional Australia, and there's specific conditions under the chef visa which might make it easier for you to then participate towards a pathway of permanency. What was the other one that was mentioned?
TPV.
TPV. So yes, that's a temporary protection visa as well. So it's probably not worth getting too caught up in the detail. I think it's more important to say that it's incredibly complicated. The lawyers that work at the SRC, we have about 30 lawyers. I see them constantly tearing their hair out because they're so confused about what's going on and the ever-changing circumstances. They're particularly, in my opinion, cruel conditions that they put people through, and make it really difficult for people to actually know how their future will unfold. There's no real clear pathway, unfortunately.
Just want to add a little bit on top of that. So while those visas are complicated, not only they are complicated, they can be really arbitrary as well. So depending on the year of your arrival, you could be falling under an entirely different class. And while I understand economically it makes sense for Australia to try to channel more migrants, including refugees, to regional areas, but in reality, in those places, often they don't have the support network. They don't have the social agency to really, imagine going to a new country for the first time and you're not being supported. You're basically thrown into the middle of nowhere. It can be incredibly difficult. And not only that, most of the applications, the actual paperwork you have to fill out, it assumes so much privilege and knowledge that I think is absolutely astonishing. We have so many refugees coming from places where they wouldn't have any education at all, and to fill in those forms, some of them asking you the place of your residence for the last 30 years. And imagine if you're being displaced and trying to fill that out.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you again, Weshi, for
it's Bill. Just to, I mean, those points are all valid. I guess one of the important roles that we play at Multicultural Australia is to provide services and assistance to help these people when they do arrive. And Wei is correct. It is complicated when people arrive like that from their home country. So we actually meet people at the airport, our case managers and bicultural support workers. We find them their first home. We provide orientation and life skills training, and most importantly, help them with healthcare education training, and if they want to, help them into work. and that's for the humanitarian visa holders, and then there are a range of other services we've got, because we recognise it is very hard. And I guess COVID-19 has even highlighted that further with the myriad and all the changes to rules and isolation and all the rest of it. So it has been difficult, and it's important that we do keep supporting these people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bill. I just wanted to ask you, Bill, since Wei pointed out a really good point that the additional difficulties that refugees face when they are being directed to rural areas, does Multicultural Australia provide these services for people that also go to rural areas, or does it only apply to Brisbane?
No, absolutely in rural areas. And we have settled people in a range of areas outside of Brisbane. And one of our more successful is not far from Brisbane, which is in Toowoomba.
Yeah.
And we've settled probably over 1,000 people up there now, and we have an office located up there. And in a regional location, of course, the key is the collaboration with communities.
Mm-hmm.
In all those types of locations, everyone really does want to help, and it's about identifying who is there that can help and working with them and using their skills to welcome these people.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. Jono, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to, I think Bill and Multicultural Australia are a really good example of how to do settlement services well. And I think there's a clear point that it is really possible to settle people and to support them to fit into a new society and all of that. But those services have to be well funded. And Way's point of arbitrariness is a good one, because there are some classes of visa and some people who come who get really good government support, and there are organisations that are specifically funded to help those people. And then there are other people on different bridging visas or TPVs who get no tangible support or very, very little support. And there's a vast difference in outcomes depending on your visa class. And so we have all these success stories of refugees who've come on humanitarian visas and been supported to settle in society, and all these positive news stories. And then simultaneously there are these hidden cohorts of people who are also effectively refugees, but virtually no support whatsoever. And that's a big problem, particularly in terms of how Australia deals with those different visa categories.
Yeah, and those support services are essential to these success stories that we have. So without those, we can't have them. Thank you, guys. Unless anyone else has anything to add, maybe we can move on to the next question. So within your work and also maybe personal experiences, how have you learned the realities that refugees face in Australia? How has the experience shown you that?
So once again, I want to echo what Jonathan has said. It really depends on what class of refugees you have been arbitrarily or otherwise, classed into, and if I want to break down all the complicated situation into a simple explanation, let's say, okay, 2 classes of refugees. I don't know, this is a grossly simplified generalization, so just bear with me. So the first class will be the people who come here on a humanitarian visa. They were already given a visa before their arrival to Australia. Most of them were displaced in, a country that is outside of their country of origin. They fulfill the definition of the UN refugee. They have applied through UNHCR or other organizations, and usually they are on the wait list for years and years, decades and decades. Finally, they get visa, they come to Australia, and then they get the support from Multicultural Australia and other organizations. So they are the relatively well-supported refugees. And then on the other hand, we have refugees who come here by boat. So those are the ones that make the spotlight, and those are the ones that are usually very, very poorly supported, if at all. In my organization, so in Refugee Treaty in Queensland, we mostly get the former, but we also have a small number of the latter. Their experience can be so different. And once again, I think people not very familiar with the refugee space, they have this idea that a war-torn country must be very poor, the people must be, peasants or something, but that can be further from the truth. So let's say a Syrian refugee versus like a refugee from Myanmar, Burma, their situation can be very different, because a Syrian refugee might be from a middle-income family. The parents might be doctors or lawyers or whatever professions before the war broke out. They were literate. They have experiencing an organized society that is not very different to Australia. Whereas a Rohingya or a current refugee from Myanmar, maybe for the last 5 generations in a family, nobody's ever attended any school whatsoever. They can't read or write in their home language, and they might never achieve a meaningful proficiency in reading or writing English either. So like, it's just impossible to generalize. And whenever there are new volunteers that come to Vortex, we tell them expect the unexpected, because you could get anything.
Yeah. Thanks, Wei.
Yeah,
I think
they're really good points. Sorry, that Wei has made, and I guess they have also been exacerbated during the recent pandemic, where a lot of the communication through that process, which was all very well intentioned by governments and communities, it was very much a one-size-fits-all, in the sense of being put out in written form, and many of the people we work with, they don't have any formal written language, to use the point that Wei raised. And so it has been really important to make sure through these past few months that other ways have been found to communicate and make sure that these people are aware of what is going on with the pandemic and what they need to do, whether it's schooling or social distancing or whatever it is. And that's certainly been eye-opening for us, when messaging like that has to be put out there very, very quickly, and where it's changing so quickly. It definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all, and it's something we need to be aware of.
I might just add I guess as a practical example that what is life like for someone who comes here, and what are some of the challenges they face. One asylum seeker we were working with, his story, he'd come from Iran. He spent several years in offshore detention centres, so he'd come by boat and spent time on Christmas Island. He'd been briefly brought to Australia for some medical treatment and thought he was going to be able to stay in Australia, and then he was taken back to Christmas Island again. So by the time he was back in Brisbane, he'd spent almost 5 years in detention centres of one form or another. He had a fairly serious physical injury to his foot, which meant that he couldn't walk long distances. And he also had some pretty severe depression and anxiety, partly from the war, but partly just from his time in detention centres. And so his visa class, he was basically in the 1 year bridging visa, getting renewed each year, but he never had any certainty about what would happen long term. So as the end of his year rocks up, he starts to get really nervous, worrying, will my visa even be renewed? And finally gets a few weeks notice saying, yep, you can stay for another year. So he wasn't given any government support, no Centrelink payments, no ongoing financial support of any kind. He was allowed to work, but because of his physical disability, his mental health issues, and his very limited English, he was finding it really, really hard to find work in Brisbane. So my office was working with him, trying to put the word out, find jobs for him. But someone who can't stand up for long periods of time and who doesn't have good English, you can imagine that it's pretty hard, already competitive job market, to find work. So with no income, he ended up sleeping in a bedroom in our share house. He was relying on just friends donating food, and was relying on free healthcare from World Wellness Centre. But there are hundreds of people like him who receive literally no government support whatsoever. And we still have to, there's that narrative out in society of, oh, refugees get the right red carpet rolled out for them and they get so much government support. But actually there are a lot of people seeking asylum who are, even if they are lucky enough to be released from detention, they're released into the community with no support whatsoever, a whole bunch of structural barriers, health issues, language barriers, etc. And they're just sort of pushed out the door to fend for themselves. And we're now seeing big cohorts of those people becoming homeless or experiencing severe poverty, which in turn puts greater strain on the support services, because those bigger organisations that get funded to care for some groups of refugees are then trying to cannibalize staff capacity and say, oh, well, we also want to help these people, even though we don't get funding for it. And so everyone in the support sector is stretched really, really thin as a result.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been the experience of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. I mean, it's crazy that we're even talking about the different classes of refugee in Australia, because if you're a refugee, and Australia owes you its protection because Australia is a signatory to the Human Rights Convention and Refugee Convention, and that's a simple matter of it. But what's been said is true, and we've seen it firsthand at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. When the pandemic started, we've had to restructure our organisation and put even more of our resources into the frontline services, because there's people who just absolutely no support, from housing to healthcare to social workers, just completely out on their own. Before this even started, the pandemic started, the government was already starting to move people off the SRSS payment that they were receiving, which is, I think, 75% of New Start, and New Start's already below the poverty level. So it was a measly payment, started moving people off it and saying to people, well, you've just got to find work. But if you've got no money and absolutely no way to even buy clothes, food, pay for anything that you need, even to get to a job interview, how are you meant to get a job? It's crazy to think down those lines. But one thing we haven't talked much about is the roughly 1,400 people who are still in immigration detention across Australia, who are being treated in ways which I can't even believe the Australian government would actually engage in. And some of the things as an organisation we actually can't talk about yet, because we have people, a lot of the people are clients of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, and we have to make a decision as to whether talking about their personal circumstances identifies them too much, and as a result would leave them to even further punishment of border force than they're already experiencing. But we know that people are being moved randomly and without any warning, and they're not being given any information about what's happening next in their determination or any timeline that the government's working towards. Peter Dutton just submitted a bill to Parliament, which is going through an inquiry phase at the moment, to try and take people's mobile phones away, because the government realised that people were, partly talking about the experiences of what they were experiencing, but they were also accessing healthcare, so social workers through their phones, and legal support, which the government's decided is probably not the way that it wants things to be. So the experiences of people in immigration detention are just incredible, and for a first world country like Australia to be behaving like that towards people at an incredible economic cost to the country as well. It costs billions of dollars to keep people in immigration detention, whereas we know that actually affording someone the right to go to school and supporting them through the Medicare system is much cheaper for Australia than it is to lock them up in detention centres. I mean, we've got Christmas Island open at the moment for one family, which is costing millions and millions of dollars that could be put into education and healthcare across Australia. So what's happening is it would be, you'd say absurd if it weren't actually the reality. The reality is just beyond what's acceptable, I believe.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I agree that a lot of our priorities sometimes are not very straight. We're spending a lot of money on things to take away the rights from people, but whereas giving them those rights and opportunities will be a lot cheaper. And the services, as Jono mentioned, a lot of times they're stretched very thin, and those determinants, all the different factors are not really considered. People always say just go and find a job if you don't want to be homeless or don't want to be taking Centrelink, if they do get Centrelink for a fact, which a lot of people on these protection visas wouldn't even get that support service. But if they're given the right opportunities, it's not just as easy to just go and get a job. There's the mental health factors, there's health, the fact that they don't have a job, or they can't afford to buy the clothes that they need to go to interviews. All these services need that holistic approach when offering these services. So since we talked about detention centres, and Jono, I know that you're actively involved as well, if you'd like to give us more information about the Kangaroo Point detention centres and how that's rolling out at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So some of you will have heard the news that there are refugees or people seeking asylum being held in detention at a hotel in Kangaroo Point. There are others at the Mantra down south, and then there are a lot of people in indefinite detention in places like BITA, Brisbane Immigration Transit Accommodation. The people in the hotels, they call them APODs, alternative places of detention, and they're meant to be there only temporarily. In some cases, it was like, oh, we're moving them there so there's more space for distancing during COVID-19. In other cases, they were moved there because existing detention centres were over capacity. Most of these men were previously on Nauru or Manus Island detention centres and were brought to the mainland because they were medevaced. So they would, you know, the doctors decide they were too great a health risk to leave in these offshore detention centres, brought to the mainland for medical treatment. Some of them still haven't gotten that medical treatment, but now they're still in these indefinite detention situations. So at Kangaroo Point, there's over 100 men held in detention there. People hear the term hotel and they think, oh, that sounds nice, but it's more like dodgy motel rooms with multiple people to a room, no space for exercise or recreation. The motel has a crappy little swimming pool in the backyard that they don't even let the men use. And they certainly can't leave the compound or go for a walk around the block or anything like that. So a whole bunch of activists have responded to call outs from the men. The men themselves started protesting on a regular basis when the pandemic hit, because one of the guards at the centre tested positive for COVID-19, and the detainees were worried that there wasn't space for social distancing. They were worried that if COVID did get into the hotel, they'd pretty much all catch it because they're in such tightly crowded accommodation. So once the men started protesting, lots of residents out around in the community have also started protesting. I think until that point, a lot of us thought, oh, we don't want to make things worse for the men by protesting. We don't want to create a situation where the government cracks down on them or increases security measures. So we're not going to do anything that might jeopardise the men's situation. But now that the men themselves have started protesting, a lot of people have sort of realised, well, this is the only sort of strategy left available to us. And I think in a way, it's been interesting to see how different professional groups and different advocacy groups have responded, because for a long time, the strategy in refugee advocacy has been very risk averse. It's been very much, don't make waves. We don't want to say anything. We don't want to say the government's racist. We don't want to call out stuff too directly because they don't want to make it a hyper partisan political issue. But I think as a result, it's dropped off the agenda completely. It certainly doesn't pop up as a big election issue anymore. And I think as a result, the government has essentially gotten away with this continued indefinite detention. So for me, it raises really interesting strategy questions about what are the most effective forms of advocacy at the moment. When the crew were considering starting these protests in support of the men inside, one of the big questions was, well, if we start protesting in support of these men at Kangaroo Point, what if the government moves them back to Christmas Island, or what if they move them to some other high security? And there's been a very deliberate agreement by all the activists involved that if the government does try and relocate men to a higher security facility, it's going to shut down the city. And it'll just be rolling blockades day after day, blocking main roads. And we hope we won't have to do that. We're hoping that the government will instead release these men into the community. But yeah, it's a high stakes strategy that I think a lot of people have resorted to out of desperation.
Yeah.
And I think the ask from the men at the moment is actually even more basic than being released into community full time. It's just to be able to leave for the day, to go out and get coffee.
Yeah, it's such a simple matter. Let us go out and exercise around the neighbourhood.
Yeah, which is what they had when they a lot of the people in Papua New Guinea, they were able to go out for the day and then come back in.
Hopefully we see some change after all the great activism that's going around in Brisbane at the moment. I don't think a lot of people know about it either, so thank you for giving all that information, Jonah and Navi. Since we're talking about asylum seekers and detention centres, it's a good time to talk about the term, the phrase "no human is illegal," and what does that mean to you, and how do you think we can change the public perception to reflect this mentality? Any of you can start.
Good question. I just, when I read that question, it just reminded me of a talk I went to by barrister Julian Burnside, and he talked about the term illegal. Actually, the last time, or the first time it was used, was in Nazi Germany to refer to people that were the Jewish people who were fleeing for their lives. They were referred to by the administration then as illegal. So it's a particularly loaded word. It's an intentional word in order to stigmatize people. And some years ago, the ASRC invested quite a bit of money into some work actually, which looks at how to talk about people and how to talk about their experiences. That research is actually available for anyone who's interested in refugee issues online at the moment. One of the examples from it is to talk about people as people, so always referring to people as people seeking asylum instead of asylum seekers, as a way of ensuring that the right message is coming across. So framing around this issue is particularly important, and the phrase illegal and the government's terminology around this issue is particularly framed in a way to divide our community and make us feel like people are different to us, or that we should be scared or fearful of others. So we really have to resist that, because as a society, that's when societies start to fall apart. And I saw that firsthand. I was very young, but that's what happened in former Yugoslavia, when the same people, the same group, the same nationality started being fearful of each other and started fighting. So it's particularly important that we resist those frames.
Yeah, I'd completely agree with Oggy on those statements, and even just that simple thing of saying people seeking asylum as opposed to something else makes a huge difference. In terms of the, and I think we need to. We're all human beings, and that's what we've got to focus on, not treating people as different. One of the things we did in terms of influencing opinion, we undertook some research last year to get some insight into community attitudes towards multiculturalism and welcoming new Queenslanders. And at a really high level, the findings we got back showed that people recognised that most of the negative rhetoric was coming from media and politics, and most people generally had a positive local experience with diversity and with migrants in their neighbourhood. And the overwhelming sense we got was that people were yearning for a different narrative, a more positive narrative to be told, if only someone would tell it. And this is one of the things we are really focused on, is to talk about them. These are human beings. They've gone through some really tough times through no fault of their own. And how can we tell those stories positively and give them that wonderful Australian fair go, which is what we're well known for.
Yeah, that's good.
And I also want to add, oh, sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah.
A bit from the legal perspective, when we say whether if a human is illegal or not, which law are we looking at exactly? So I think most of the panelists will know it's Australian law, and it's arbitrary because laws change all the time. And if we look at a different set of law or conventions, so the UN Convention on Refugees, which Australia is obviously a signatory to, our domestic laws don't reconcile very well with the convention that we signed up. And it's just so ridiculous to say, oh, here is this whole set of convention that is almost universally agreed to, but no, in this country of ours, we put forward a different set of laws, and people who don't follow our little set of laws are therefore illegal, even though under the convention, which so many countries, including Australia, have agreed to and have signed, say they are doing what's perfectly and they are right to do.
Yeah.
I think flowing on from that, and really there's a broader meta-narrative that needs to be contested in Australian discourse, and it's that idea of scarcity, because obviously a lot of people are feeling pinched economically, feeling like there's not enough to go around. And when we start talking about welcoming refugees, there's a lot of people who are like, what do you mean we want to welcome more people? I can't even afford a house or whatever. And to challenge that narrative, we need to talk about the injustices of our current economic system and recognise that right now there's a small minority of wealthy, privileged, powerful people who are phenomenally wealthy and getting richer all the time and screwing over Australian workers and screwing over migrant workers. They're screwing over all of us. And then making us blame one another for the fact that we're only getting crumbs while they're hoarding the whole cake. And so as a lot of us are stuck in our sort of little progressive bubbles, but as a city councillor, I find myself talking to people from across the political spectrum and people who might be a bit more conservative or think a little bit differently about the world, and starting the conversation about through that lens and saying, well, actually there's plenty to go around. There's enough resources, there's enough wealth for us all to have full bellies and a roof over our head. The problem is that this corporate sector or these privileged elites are hoarding wealth for themselves and then using refugees as a scapegoat for the fact that you can't afford a house. So challenging that narrative, I think, becomes really important. So we can talk a lot about the importance of welcoming and the importance of the fact that migrants and refugees can contribute positively to Australian society. But we also need to be able to diagnose why people are struggling. And so rather than saying, no, you're not struggling, Australia's a wealthy nation, we've got plenty of room, we have to say, actually, you might be struggling a little bit, and you're struggling because the government is screwing you over to further the interests of big corporations. And that message resonates with people who otherwise, if you just come to them and say, let's let more people in, they're like, no, we don't have.
It's really interesting, Donna. It's such a good point. And, it becomes part of people's psyche without people realizing it as well. And I know that even, my partner's family's barbecues and Christmases where, there's always that one uncle that comes up to you and then starts talking to you about, how much of a problem refugees are causing in Australia. And I say, well, I'm a refugee. And then you get, oh, well, you're different. You're a European refugee or whatever it might be. But it shows exactly how important it is to connect people and for people to experience each other and to get to know each other so that they see each other as human beings as opposed to what the perception that they get from the media or from the government or from other sources. So, and the SRC tries to do that work really also by ensuring that we have people with lived experience of seeking asylum or refugees being most often the spokespeople for the organisation, and also we do a lot of work to try and get those stories into the media and into people's lives as much as possible, and that's a really important piece of work as well, I think, because it helps to push back on some of those other narratives. But it's really hard work because so much of Australia's media is owned by one person who also happens to be an incredibly conservative person, and it's challenging.
Thank you guys. I'll be really interested in looking at the research that you guys did. I'll have to look that up later. And I agree that the divisive narrative, I've seen that even bring divide within refugees and people seeking asylum as well. Way more often I run into refugees who think that people seeking asylum are doing the wrong thing, even though they might have had very similar experiences before coming to Australia. But that narrative that's in the media, it's bringing the divide within the communities themselves. You'll see humanitarian refugee, like Afghans, judging those that are coming on the boats just because they had a different way of coming to Australia. Even though they understand completely what background they come from and the struggles that had forced them to come here. It's like, if I could come here, why didn't you? And that's all happening because of the narrative that's being put out in the politics and the media. So thank you for the great points you all raised. I would just like to remind all the attendees that you can ask questions in the chat throughout the panel, and we will do a Q&A at the end. For the next question, I would like to know what the most challenging part of your work is. We've touched base on it throughout the conversation so far, but if you could tell us more about the challenging aspects of your work and how that can be overcome.
I might start because I'm probably going to say something a little bit provocative, and I don't mean to offend anyone. But, like the traditional narrative of, oh, if you want to change the system, you need to get elected. That's oh well, if you don't like what's going on, Jono, why don't you run for office and become a politician? I've done that, and it's still not enough. And I think, like, I'm at the point now where, as an elected representative, I'm starting to say we need to engage in more hard-nosed activism, and we need to be a little bit more assertive and recognize that these are human rights abuses. This is not just a debate about rational people disagreeing about, which way to take the economy. This is about people's lives and racism. And one of the hardest things I grapple with, actually, is that there are a lot of organizations in the advocacy space who, because they're reliant on government funding and because they don't want to make waves and want to maintain a seat at the table, they can't be too political or too out there. And I think, unfortunately, compared to, say, the European experience, or even what's happening in places like Canada, over there are a lot of organizations that they're very non-partisan. They never support a political party, and they're very diligent about saying, no, we don't support any particular political party. We are non-partisan. But they're still willing to get political. They're still willing to say, this is bad policy, that's good policy, this is racist, that's what we should do instead. Whereas, unfortunately, in the Australian landscape, a lot of those bigger orgs have been disciplined by neoliberalism. So they'll speak behind the scenes, and they'll use their connections to have conversations with ministers, etc. But it's very, very rare for them to say anything publicly that's particularly critical of the government or people in power. And so as a result, you end up in a situation where there's this small group of activists who don't have much institutional legitimacy, and then maybe a few Greens politicians or progressive politicians talking about it. But then all the big orgs who are perhaps the most active in the refugee sector, they're really reluctant, with a few obvious exceptions, including some of the crew here in this conversation. But a lot of those big orgs are too scared to speak out directly. And that has a de-escalatory or deflationary impact on the whole conversation, because you've just got this vocal group of activists over here speaking out about the issue, and everyone else is really silent. So when you have all these professionals and middle-class Australians saying, well, how much should I care about this? Oh, that big organisation who I respect and who seems to know what it's talking about, it doesn't say much. And so, it creates an interesting challenge where, in some senses, silence is complicity. And if an organisation is not willing to speak out and publicly condemn the government for some pretty atrocious human rights abuses, if it's not willing to do that, then it's just almost a tacit endorsement. And that's a really tricky thing to navigate.
Would anyone like to add on to that? Those are some really good points.
No, very good points. And one of the reasons I chose to work at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre is because the organisation, since it was founded 20 years ago, and we still have the same CEO, the founding CEO, the premise of the organisation was not to take federal government funding for exactly that reason, so the organisation can continue to be fearless. And that has some significant challenges, because then the organisation is completely relying on fundraising, and that can be up and down. But the ability to be able to speak out freely is something that is particularly important. And having worked in politics, I know exactly what Jono is talking about, and I've seen it so often, and it breaks your heart almost. The question was around the hardest thing. I think working in the refugee sector can be really quite deflating, to be honest, because you're exposed to real people who are being treated atrociously, and it's easy to feel hopeless sometimes. But there are so many incredible organisations across the country who are on the front line supporting people, and there's so many stories of success of where people's lives have been completely turned around, and then those people have gone on to work for the organisations and support the organisations to support other refugees. And that the aspect of it that's deflating, particularly given the current political context in Australia, once you roll up your sleeves, I think, and start actually working with people, and you see people's lives changing, turning around, for the positive, that's also, I think, drives a lot of people to keep going, and it's important to keep going because collectively we have to.
Yeah, I think from my side in the challenging aspects, probably over the last 2 or 3 months with what's been going on worldwide, I guess probably two things. One is we have seen the impact on our clients in Australia, whether they're refugees or asylum seekers, of the impact of their worries and the impact on their mental health of the other members of their family who are still overseas and in whatever situation they're in, and knowing that at the moment they can't get out of the situation they're in and come to Australia because the borders are shut. And that's been a significant impact on them. While here in Australia they've got their own circumstances, it's almost been their worry for their other members of their family, and we've provided additional assistance to help them. I think the other challenge for us, and it's already been talked about, has been because we work with people seeking asylum as well as refugees. Those that are on temporary visas have not been able to access funding, a lot of the funding or much of the funding that's been available, particularly around income support, and that's already been mentioned. So things like Job Seeker have not been available to many of the people we're looking after, and that's meant we have had to be fairly agile in terms of how we provide service. We have had some wins with some levels of government in providing additional funds, which is wonderful, but there's still a significant cohort of people who haven't got the appropriate income support during this really tough time. So we are certainly concerned as this pandemic rolls on as to what after it's over, what we're going to find. And I think there will be some more health issues, homelessness that we will. So that will be an ongoing challenge, I think.
I echo Bill's sentiment that COVID-19 hits the refugee community very hard. It's definitely very much reflected in the work that Vortex does. So our program is funded on the premise of people going into the homes of refugee families to help them with things, which hasn't been going on in the last, basically since March, because of all the social distancing restrictions. And even after home visitation restrictions have been lifted in late May, early June, we still weren't able to just let our volunteers go into these refugee families' houses because the undergoing risk and there's just so many disadvantages being faced by the refugees compared to the general Australian population. So for example, there's the issue of overcrowdedness in housing, lack of access to information. Some of them may not really understand the whole process of what has been going on with the different rule changes. At some point the rules change every second day when it came to social distancing. And so only next week, basically, we are slowly easing our volunteers back to face-to-face tutoring again with some guidelines from us. So they have to make sure that the families they visit are able to cater for social distancing. The house has to be big enough and not too crowded so that the family plus the tutor. So usually it's between like 2 to 5 people in a team. They can all have their own space. And aside from the COVID-19 episodes, I very much agree with what Guy and Jono have said about problems facing institutions, civil private institutions that try to help refugees, such as Vortex. It's really hard for us to define how much advocacy we want to take, and it's been another ongoing issue we have discussed over the past few years. We are very much stretched, like everybody else. We are stretched very thin. So the entire organization of 400 volunteers have only one paid staff, and that is not myself. I have a day job, and that's outside of the Vortex. And basically, whatever this paid staff, she's a wonderful lady. Whatever she is not able to do, the volunteers have to do ourselves outside of a day job. And it can be very challenging, and to negotiate a line of how much political we can get. So yeah, I would say that's some of the biggest challenges in the work of Vortex. And from a little personal note, as a solicitor working in plaintiff personal injuries, so I help people who have gotten into accidents, like work accidents or car accidents. My firm has a particular focus on helping ethnic clients, so I work in those lawyers, and I have asylum seekers or refugees, people seeking asylum and also refugee clients as well. And not only them, but the other non-Anglo-Saxon clients in general, they face such a steep battle when it comes to facing insurance companies, government agencies. The racism is so very much part of the whole system. It's just mind-boggling the amount of work that is left to be done.
Thank you all for raising some really, really good points. It can be a pretty overwhelming job to be in this sector, but it is the work that we need to do. And like you guys, there is a lot of other people that are very young and passionate and want to do a lot more. So I would want to know how you think other passionate individuals can mobilize with others and become involved in fighting for injustice and advocate for refugee rights through practical ways, whether that's advocacy, direct action, or otherwise.
We've got a online rally coming up this coming Thursday on the 2nd of July at 6 o'clock. We've had almost 2,000 people RSVP to attend to it, which is incredible. And the focus of it will be to actually hear from people directly in detention currently in Australia. So we've got Moz, who's at Mantra at the moment, and Fahad, who's at Kangaroo Point, and also a survivor from Nauru as well, speaking directly about what they've experienced. There will be some calls to action at that event as well. So I'd love for people to come along to that. But there's a whole heap of work that lots of different organisations are doing. So there's lots of opportunities for people to get involved, and also through political action as well. If we want to change what's happening in Canberra as well, I think we have to ensure that people vote in the way that they want to see Canberra represented as well, and that does make a big difference as well. So yeah, there's a whole heap of NGO and political, and we've got to, at the end of the day, though, we all have to work together because we're up against it.
Yeah.
If I'm able to make some pitches, so basically Vortex exists in a space for people who might not want to get political or have the ability to, or basically they don't really understand the political situation, but still want to help refugees, and that's where we stand. So our volunteers are incredibly diverse. We have really young people who are still in university. Basically anyone aged 18 or even 16, if you have supervision, you can come and join our program, and we hope you get a blue card. You can be on board. So we have people aged from 16 all the way to 70s or 80s who are volunteering with us, and they're hoping to change the lives of refugees in very direct ways, 1 week at a time. They're hoping people and support them. I understand that it's not a systematic impact, and as I think it's just, we've got to admit that not everyone is, it's fitted or they're willing to go down the way of being political. So while if you want systematic changes, you got to do what Jono and Ogi suggest. But on the other hand, if someone just wants to have more of a, how do I phrase this? Yeah, so on an everyday way without involving political representation, this is something Vortex does. And as a young person, so I've only been out of uni for 2 years, I think it's always important to engage in conversations, even just with every person around you, your friends, your families, because in Australia, every citizen has the right to vote, and that vote can impact on something or others. And I know a lot of people, a lot of more of my introverted or timid friends, they will never go out in a protest, and they might not even read much about politics or even news, but they might want to hear their friends and what they have to say. And while it seems like a lot of people, your Facebook post or your Twitter, in other words, you put out on your social media might not go really far because it seems really incremental. But I personally have had so much inspiration and so much learning from the things that my friends have shared with me, and it really changed me as a person, changed my political view, and changed the way that I want to be an activist. And very, very luckily, I've also had people come up to me to say that the things I've shared with them have changed their views as well. And that's, I think, one way people can go about working for human rights and refugee rights.
Thank you.
I might chime in as well. Obviously, I'm going to tell people to vote Greens, like stop political parties that are keeping people in indefinite detention, stop voting for political parties that are abusing human rights. You can number every box so your vote's not wasted. That's important for a lot of people to understand. But right now on the ground, there's a movement growing, and the kind of activism we're seeing outside the Mantra Hotel and particularly the Kangaroo Point Hotel in Brizzy is kind of unprecedented in a way. Activists have actually physically prevented Serco, the security company, from transferring men to higher security facilities. They've literally stood in the way of the man and forced the Serco guards to go back in the compound and let the men stay where they are. And that's just with a couple of people. And now as numbers grow, there are thousands of people getting involved in that blockade, which creates a really interesting pressure point, because the government can't easily transfer these men back to offshore detention centres or to higher security facilities, because they'll be held to pay if they do, and people will shut down the city. But as the pressure increases, and as we go from 2,000 people in the street to 10,000 and 20,000 people in the street, it's really difficult for the government to resist that kind of mass movement. So there's a strategic opening at the moment with these men that we haven't seen before. And a lot of it comes from the fact that people have a hard time caring about refugees because it feels like this abstract thing. It's somewhere away. Once you're on the ground and you can literally look over a fence and see the detainees and talk to them, and they're literally just a few meters away, you build a stronger emotional connection that's hard for people to walk away from. And so I'm seeing a lot of potential with this blockade that reminds me a little bit of the Lady Salento vigil in 2016, where we successfully stopped a mum and her baby from being sent back to offshore detention. But this is another scale altogether. So if you're looking for practical ways to get involved, the blockade needs assistance in all sorts of ways. It needs people to help with admin behind the scenes. It needs people who can help just by rocking up and sharing food. It needs people who can do overnight shifts, keeping an eye on the transfer vans and preventing transfers late in the night. People who can help run sound systems, musicians. There's so many ways to get involved with that campaign. So if you're in Brizzy, just head down to 721 Main Street and say hi. There's a big rally coming up again tomorrow afternoon. And although some of the media coverage has made it seem quite controversial and there's been arrests and all that sort of stuff, it's really peaceful and really positive, and a good space to meet other like-minded people who are also passionate about this stuff. So don't be afraid to get involved and introduce yourself.
Bill, would you like to add anything onto?
Look, probably just to on the top of what Waya was saying, we also work with a lot of volunteers. So we're always looking for people who want to get to know a bit more about what we do and who our clients are and how they can provide assistance. So always happy to talk to people about that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Before we get into the Q&A section of tonight, I just wanted to ask one last question, as I'm really interested to know your point of view as well. To be in this space in the refugee sector or being activist, it can be quite frustrating, you know, because of the circumstances. Sometimes you feel like, you know, there's not much happening, or just seeing every day with the challenges that you discussed before, or meeting the people and hearing their stories, that can be quite overwhelming, and it can have a huge impact on us as well, the person within the sector or the activist. So how would you suggest to others to practice good emotional and mental health, because it's also really important for us to be well while we're in this sector, to continue doing what we're doing.
good point. Really important point to take care of yourself and make sure that you live a balanced life. And I think that means also doing things outside of activism itself. And I know it's hard for many of us to think that that's possible, but there is another life out there, and it's important for people to be connected and doing different things as well. So it's certainly something I try and do in my life. There's times when I just switch off from everything that's happening, which is hard to do, but just make time to be with my family. And we've got my partner and I, a 2-year-old, and when you spend time with him, the whole world stops, and you just you can't even think about anything else most of the time, which has actually been really helpful.
That's wonderful.
I think it's a really important point, and certainly with Multicultural Australia, really critical for our workers. Typically, certainly pre-COVID, a lot of our environment at work was really built around fun and music and a lot of food. Somehow, we always used to eat a lot of food and celebrate things. So I guess with most of our people now working from home, we've had to ensure that we've got this connection still continuing, even if in a virtual way. And yeah, that's going okay. We had a bit of fun recently with we all got behind the 10,000 steps program that ran last week, or sorry, the last few weeks. And we had teams at work doing the steps and competing against each other, and we had a lot of fun with that. And I guess it helped demonstrate that we are really still connected, and it is important, as someone else said, just to be aware of yourself and make sure you take time off to do what you love doing, whether it's family or on your own or whatever. So yeah, thank you.
I have 2 points to raise in regards to looking after my mental health. So one point would be to look at how far the progress I have made, how far the progress my organization has made. And I think it's, in some way, it's a huge privilege to work in a refugee space and to look after people who are so marginalized, so disadvantaged, and some of the most persecuted people in the world. And we know that however little we do for them makes a huge difference. As in, because the starting point could be so low, what you are able to do for them means a tremendous amount to them. And if you reflect on this sort of progress, it takes you away from the negative mind space and be like, oh no, there's still so much to be done. I am not being helpful, or I'm not being useful enough. So that's my first point. And my second point is, although there were times when throughout pro bono or throughout working in Vortex, the stories I've come across made me totally cried and just thought, how could this people be so unfortunate? But on the other hand, I think working in this space has helped me a lot more in my mental health than take away from it. Because whenever when I used to do frontline volunteering before I became an executive member in the committee, whenever I went to the refugee family's house, I reflected on how fortunate and how privileged I am. And just, it makes me feel like, it makes me feel so inspired to be like, if these people can live through this adversity, then I can learn from them. And yeah, so I feel like it's a privilege to serve, actually. I would very much like to hear from Sanam, actually, because you work in mental health and you probably have very interesting perspectives to give us.
I constantly get overwhelmed myself. It can be quite an overwhelming job as well. And as you said, sometimes you just need to switch off. And it comes to a point where you just get so frustrated and you feel like you're not doing enough, and you just want to change the world, but there's not enough that you can do. And sometimes some things are out of our hands. There's only so much we can do, but some things that there's simply nothing you can do about, but you are doing everything in your capacity that you can do. Sometimes I just need to remind myself that I'm doing things in my capacity, and that's enough. And I don't need the burden of the entire world on my shoulders. So you just need to let yourself know that sometimes, and do what you can to your best potential, best capability. And other than that, just take a step back and breathe, which can be really hard to do sometimes. But that's what works for me, and sometimes I tell others as well too, you know, that's how to approach this space. We will jump onto the Q&A if that's okay, just because there's a lot of questions. And I don't know if you guys can see the Q&As yourself. There's the option of typing answers. There's a few contact people that are asking for contact details of Facebook events. So if you guys can answer those yourself, maybe on the chat, just typing the response. It might save us time because so we can touch on the other topics a little bit more. We'll go by the questions that have been voted up the most, and then if we have time, we'll just keep going down the list. So the first question is, how do you think we can best address the long-standing negative narratives and misinformation that has been presented by political leaders and the media regarding asylum seekers and refugees, both in the wider public and amongst family and friends?
A good question. I think we touched on it a little bit before with that idea of explaining why there's this sense of scarcity and that there's enough to go around if the big end of town just pays their fair share of tax. I think we also need to argue for a more robust form of multiculturalism, because sometimes if you tell people, oh, multiculturalism is great, and they think, oh, yeah, you mean like different food and different sounding music and people wearing different outfits. But there's more to multiculturalism than that. And so understanding and articulating those deeper, richer values of different cultures and cross-cultural exchange, I think is really important. But storytelling is really the answer. It's personal connection and personal stories, one-on-one narratives where people get up and testify about their experiences. I think, you know, rather than statistics, rather than quoting dollar figures about how much it costs us to keep people up, sharing human stories about other human beings is what.
Thank you.
Yeah, I very much agree with Jonathan, the fact that, you know, there's a sharing of stories, and it's something Vortex is trying to do as well. We try to share the stories of our volunteers interacting with the refugees and sharing the refugee story. Obviously, there's difficulties along with that because of, you know, disclosure. We don't want them to be identified. But it is the human stories that touches the emotions that let people remember after all the statistics have gone out of the head. And so for as long as our media is held in the hand of this one man in Australia, I think what we can try to do on our ends would be to share among our family and friends or our network, or work in an activist space enough to the point that you have more than just your friends and networks listening to you.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it is the stories of the journeys of these people is, I mean, that's what makes them human like us. And we can all not only need to listen, but we can learn from their stories. And one of our clients that I met a few months ago, who's been in Australia for 8 years and he's still on a temporary visa. He still hasn't got a permanent visa, and he refuses to badmouth anyone in Australia. He's grateful to what has happened to him in Australia. And his one of his lines that I'll never forget was that if you stay positive, miracles will happen. And I think all of us could learn from his resilience and his determination just to do what he's had to do and to get where he is today. So, yeah, I think the storytelling is an age-old craft, but I think we've got to do it and do a lot more of it.
Thank you. So the next question is, what would be the ideal redistribution of government funding that would allow for better funding and financial support? And what tweaks would need to be made to the ideal solution to make it palatable for governments?
Bill, now's your chance. Tell us what you need funding for. And Ogie, what's not getting enough funding at the moment?
So I'm reading the question again. I'm trying to understand it. What's not getting enough funding? Everything needs more funding at the moment. Like I said, at the SRC, the frontline services are stretched. We have about 100 staff that work there, and about almost 2,000 people that volunteer at the SRC every year. everyone from people who give out, who deliver the ESL classes to doctors who give up their time to see patients at the ASRC. All of the frontline services are completely stretched. We're struggling to feed people, we're struggling to house people, and ensure that they're connected to Australian, into the community. So any money really donated towards frontline services makes a big difference. I work in advocacy, and I donate to the ASRC because I feel like I don't do enough at the frontline services end, and it helps alleviate some of my guilt. Partially, yeah, there's not just the ASRC, there's so many other organisations that are doing incredible frontline services, and at the moment, you know, we're trying to change government policy, and if we can change government policy, that will maybe make it unnecessary for some of the frontline services to need as much support. But at the moment, the frontline services are so smashed that really we have to support them in any way that we can. But I think this is about redistribution, and I think the question is about redistribution more broadly, and I think the government really has to, people have to be aware that of exactly what Jono was talking about before, that the government is looking after people who are incredibly wealthy and forgetting everyone else. So we need to redistribute from the super rich to everyone else, because at the end of the day, this is our society and people shouldn't be missing out, is my view as well.
Thank you, Abby. Would anyone else like to add on to that question, the answer?
Look, I think just to add to what I was saying before, I think right at the moment, the temporary visa holders, people seeking asylum in particular, and is in this current situation, they're not getting the appropriate amount of income support, and yeah, they've got no access or very little access to any of the federal government funding, particularly things like Job Seeker, and that's where we have been advocating for additional assistance for them. It doesn't have to be exactly what the Job Seeker is at the moment, but it should be something, because they are really, really struggling. These are some of the most vulnerable people in our community. So that was the main thing for me.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, so the next question here is, given international law is non-binding, how do we ensure accountability? And that goes to the discussion that we had earlier. Weishi, maybe you would like to add on to it, because...
My answer is probably not helpful at all. I mean, look, if there's a mechanism, we wouldn't be where we are today. I don't know, Ogie and Jono, do you want to add something to this?
From the bottom up, yeah, international law is largely toothless. It has moral force, and we can say, oh, look, this violates the Refugee Convention, or, oh, look, our government isn't respecting international law. But it's up to people on the ground in each nation to argue, hey, this is wrong. We want our government to change, because the government, you know, the people who run our political system, the politicians in federal government, their jobs don't depend on what China thinks of them or what the UK thinks of them. Their jobs depend on the support of the Australian public. And so it's up to the Australian public to withdraw their support and pressure on the government from below, rather than relying on other countries that have their own issues, their own human rights issues, somehow pressuring the Australian government, because there's not enough pressure there through those international mechanisms.
And, you know, enshrining some of those protections in our own law as well, and pushing for that. I think Australia is the only Western democracy that doesn't have a charter of rights, for example. So there's campaigns out there pushing for that, and I'm incredibly supportive, because at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that the legal system that we function within ensures people's basic human rights are met.
Thank you guys. I know we touched on this earlier in regards to COVID-19 and how that's impacted refugees. The next question is, how has the extended border closures as a result of COVID-19 affected displaced persons, both in Australia and internationally? So if you'd like to add on to what you said earlier, that'd be great.
One really immediate practical issue is that for the people held in community detention or in the A pods in places like Kangaroo Point Hotel, COVID has meant that they're not able to get visitors or gifts. So previously the men in the Kangaroo Point Hotel were at least able to have, you had to go through a lot of security checks. It was really bureaucratic, but you could get permission to visit people, and you could even give them things like SIM cards and that sort of stuff, depending on their circumstances. But with COVID, that's been completely cut off. So there's an extra barrier there in terms of the people who are in detention.
Yeah, what's happening outside of Australia is probably a little bit beyond my expertise. But a lot of the people who we work with and a lot of the people who we're in contact with, one of the big issues for them is family reunion as well. The fact that our borders have closed has made that almost impossible. As people who are either living in our community or currently in immigration detention who haven't seen their children for, upwards of 10 years in some instances. And that's really heartbreaking to hear those people's stories. I mean, like I've said, we've got a 2-year-old, and I can't, a few weeks ago I spent a couple of nights away from him, and I was so glad to see him again after I came back home. I just can't imagine what it's like for people who've been separated and displaced from each other for such a long time. But COVID's definitely made that more difficult. And a lot of the organisations that were campaigning for family reunions it's virtually impossible at the moment to get that across the line.
I'm not sure if I'm able to provide any sophisticated answer provided a time frame, and whether if I'm just saying something that's common knowledge. But internationally speaking, displaced people certainly have been more impacted by COVID-19 due to situations like crowded refugee camps. And also, like Jono has spoken about, even in Australia, we have those detention centres where people are not able to practice social distancing. And as I understand, people in Nauru and Manus, sometimes women are not even given basic sanitary items. And so I am not entirely sure how much soap or hand sanitizers they might be given. So when COVID-19 has reached some of the most, in places where sanitation is the hardest to be kept, such as Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where we have almost 500,000 Rohingya refugees and asylum seekers, people seeking asylums are based. It's very much a nightmare, where the infections would just spike incredibly. Not sure if that was a helpful answer.
Just unmuted again. I was typing before, so I didn't want to distract you guys too much with that. If there is no more to add to that, we might jump onto 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap up the event. So someone pointed out regarding Haley's question, what is your prediction of government's attitudes towards refugees and immigrants? Do you think states are shifting towards nationalistic in future?
I think this is a big issue. There's definitely concerns that as economic recession hits, there might be a shift towards greater xenophobia and protectionism and nationalism, which makes it all the more important that we advocate really, really strongly and assertively stand up for refugee rights and the rights of all displaced people. I haven't yet seen like a big surge, but you can already see some of it coming, the way people like Andrew Bolt are trying to blame Muslims for COVID-19 outbreaks, that sort of stuff. That there's a risk that we're going to see more of that. Really assertive and strong in pushing back against that kind of nationalism and racism as soon as it pops up.
And earlier during the pandemic, there was this huge surge of racism against Chinese ethnicity, people of Chinese ethnicity. Yeah, and it's definitely quite a trend that whenever a society feels that they are under risk of any sort, xenophobia will be one of the first things they turn to, blame it on the foreigners, blame it on the people who don't look like us.
Yeah, there's certainly it's out there, and I agree with the past 2 panelists, what they've said, and it is also tied up in what Jono was saying before about the abundance and scarcity, that people immediately go to that aspect as well. We're certainly we've been advocating and talking about it, and from our point of view, focus again on the positives and that all of us really can bring positive things. It's not about differentiating people and blaming people. I don't think that gets anyone anywhere. So it comes back to that storytelling, in my view, and helping to change this narrative. And COVID is beyond anyone's control largely. So it's about how we can, cooperate and collaborate and get through it together without singling people out.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've seen it. We came to Australia in 1998, and I remember 2000 was the year of volunteer and year of multiculturalism, and the community attitude was so different 20 years ago to what it is now. I see that so clearly. I actually went back and read 1984 recently again, and for me, some of those things in the book, which we're experiencing now around mass surveillance and government control and issues around that are playing out, and they are concerning, and there are things that we've got to push against, because slowly those things and those sorts of approaches start to take away our freedoms and start to break away our societies, and unless we're vigilant and responding, those in power will want more power, and we've got to work together to take the power back.
Thank you. Thanks, Yogi. I would quickly like to give a shout out to all the people listening in from Kangaroo Point blockade. We just had a comment that there are people listening in from there. So thank you all for the work you're doing. And I will try to wrap this up quickly and pass it on to Joel at the end, since we're talking about the future. What makes you hopeful for the future, and what changes need to be made?
I'm very hopeful about the future. Absolutely. I think that, I've seen so many times where communities come together and one, where good outcomes have happened, where people's lives have changed, it's easy to lose sight of that, particularly as we're all kind of distanced from each other as a result of the pandemic, and we're spending more time alone than together, and meeting online like this more so as opposed to in person. It's easy to start to lose sight of that, but there's so much good stuff happening out there. I feel really positive and hopeful.
I think I'm also quite a utopian by nature. I think it's possible to change the world for the better, and I think what we often forget is how quickly things can change. Between the space of a few weeks, the world economy can massively shift. In the space of a few weeks, people in the US have gone from not really caring very much about racism and police violence to nationwide conversations about abolishing the police. Those things have happened really, really quickly. So sometimes it feels like we're slogging away for ages and not seeing much of a change, and then suddenly something clicks. So it's up to all of us to be ready for those opportunities and those moments of great change, and to build the foundation so that when those moments arise, we're ready to leap on them. I'm excited about the world. I think there's good stuff bubbling away, and there's a lot of amazing things bubbling up from the ground, from the grassroots, and we just have to tap in and support that stuff and cross our fingers that it leads us in the right direction.
Totally. And just on that, Jono, I mean, a few months ago, who would have thought that the government would make childcare free in Australia, or provide billions of dollars of safety net for people, all of a sudden stop caring about a budget black hole and spend all that money. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Things change so quickly, hey?
I think for me, on top of what people have already said, I think the other thing coming out of the recent past has been the increase in collaboration, and everyone really has got in and tried to help, whether it's what we do or what anyone's been doing, whether it's schooling, medical or health or whatever it is, and that gives me some feeling of positivity for the future, that if we can do it through this pandemic, then as we move through it and hopefully come out the other side, if we can learn from that and continue to work together for the better for everyone. So we've had to do it, and so we've done it. Let's try and keep doing it.
Thank you. Before we wrap things up, if you guys, Weishi, do you want to add anything to what everyone else has said?
One quick thing. Yeah, I wasn't going to say it, but I very much agree with the points everyone raised, and especially Jono, like your words gave me hope. Actually, I think I'm a bit of less optimistic people than some of the others in the panel, and my friends sometimes say, you know, I can be a bit of a little bit gloomy sometimes. But yeah, at the moment we are seeing Australians giving each other a hands up rather than a hands out, and we are seeing might not be nearly to some people's liking, it's not enough, but we are seeing a little bit redistribution of wealth. People be like, you know, it's not okay for people to lose jobs and to starve, or for people to lose their mortgage. And what if the world can come together to do what Australia and many other countries that are doing, you know, but instead of being a country, we look at it as the world. And we do need to do that. With COVID-19, we already know wealthy countries have to pitch in to help the developing countries to get their vaccine, to get their drugs, to get their treatments. And so what if the world come to see that letting these refugee issues run on is not okay? You know, we no longer want to let such thing go on. What if we come together and to put a stop, or at least put a big pause to such a thing? And the idea of this possibly happening is giving me hope.
Thank you, everyone. I know you all touched on different events that are coming up and volunteer opportunities with the organizations as well. If there's anything else you would like to add on what people can do, people that are listening in tonight, what else they can do to get involved and support you guys, please feel free to say it.
As well as the blockade, I might just give out a shout out for Romero Centre. They're a fairly independent local org that does great work supporting asylum seekers and refugees here on the ground in Brizzy. They're based in Dutton Park. So if you're looking for another group to support locally and perhaps volunteer with, look up Romero Centre, ROMERO.
Oh, I want to add something along with that. So Romero Centers, they take actual food to deliver to people in need as well, not just money. So all the people who stocked up during the panic buying, when you have too many cans of tuna sitting in your pantry, donate them to Romero Centre.
Yes, and give back some of your toilet paper, everyone.
Yeah, and with Vortex, we are always looking for volunteers, even though not in the immediate future, because we are still not back to full operation. We are not fully running, but in 2 or 3 months' time, hopefully, we will be looking for many volunteers again, and to replace some of the ones who sadly have to leave the organization because they are just not, they're just not in a good space to continue doing anything that might require them to be in close proximity of anybody else because of immune compromised family members or something. Yeah, so we're looking for volunteers. Let your friends and family know we are a great organization, I promise. That's why I'm here for 6 years. So it's a very rewarding experience, and it's not too much of a time commitment. It's usually just 1 or 2 hours a week. You know, you could do it on a weeknight or on a weekend. You visit a family, you get to build a friendship, you get to understand different culture. It's great.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all so much for the... Bill, did you want to add something?
No, nothing more from me.
No.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for such an engaging discussion. It was great talking to all of you, and thanks for everyone that listened in. I would like to pass it on to Sarah, and just a quick thank you to the organizing team for having all of us here as well. Sarah, I will let you wrap it up. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you all so much to our incredibly inspiring speakers and moderator for taking time out of your busy schedules, and to our attendees for listening to an important and engaging discussion on refugee rights and issues. It's also great to hear about the ways that we can all get involved. I've been involved in Multicultural Australia a little bit, and I'm hoping to get involved in Vortex once it gets up and running again. So we remain very hopeful for refugees and asylum seekers in Australia with valuable contributors such as yourselves. And we hope you enjoyed the event and learnt a lot. And we remind all attendees that donations are encouraged to excellent local groups that are supporting refugees and asylum seekers, including Multicultural Australia, Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and Vortex. The links are in the chat. We'll also be emailing out the links to the YouTube video to all attendees after the event. And now, Joelle, over to you. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again to incredible speakers. It was an incredible talk. I'm really engaged. And Wei, I agree. I'm also a bit more optimistic about the future than I was before. It's good. And I think that leads to my first main point of conclusion is that please look after yourself. Mental health is massively important. There's a lot of people working in some really tough areas and, you know, they are heroes, but you need to look after yourself as well because the burnout is real in volunteer organizations, especially in such you know, tough places to work. So thanks again for everyone who does work in these areas and we really appreciate it, but look after yourself. So massive thanks again to all the speakers, moderator. Sanam was an awesome job. Thank you for that. Thanks to Sarah and Ashara for putting in a lot of work organizing everything. To wrap up, I was going to say there's some really cool stuff touched on this evening and links to actually some of the events we're having coming up. The next one in 11 July, we're doing a Yoga for Peace event in a cathedral in the city. And we are also big fans of Romero Centre. So we've had a past yoga session that raised funds for Romero because they do great work. And this next event in July, we'll be looking at, you know, looking after yourself, mental health, and also raising some funds for Romero Centre. In August, we're doing a event focused on humanitarianism, especially young change makers doing this important work as well. So it'll be quite exciting, and we'll be posting links to that as well. And actually, Oggy beat me to the point, talking about wealth distribution. We are, in September, putting together some pretty cool experts to talk about the future we want in economic terms. Getting people to talk about intergenerational inequality. I always stuff that word up. Stuff like modern monetary theory, but really trying to uncover and unpack, you know, who's going to pay for the recovery from COVID? What does fairness look like in an economic system after, you know, an unprecedented pandemic? And what we think is a fair way to rebuild the economic system in the future. So some really cool events coming up. We'll be sharing that information. Everybody who registered tonight, please follow our Facebook, LinkedIn, and all the social media accounts, and we will be putting that stuff out very soon. So once again, thank you to everyone who came along. Feel free to share this video with your friends and family. And as has been mentioned tonight, there's some elections coming up. Vote for whoever you like, but make sure you discuss the refugee policy of your preferred parties with your friends and family, and make it an important part of who you vote for. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Thank you to all.
See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Great talk. See you soon.
See ya.